Right, there we go. Recording has started. Right then, let's make a start as people start to trickle into the event tonight. So, yeah, hi everybody, and welcome to the Welsh Azure User Group meetup for the 15th of Feb 2023. Thanks to everybody for joining us. As usual, we've got a great couple of speakers on for you tonight. So we'll just get things started. Usual format, just to give you a quick intro to the Welsh Azure User Group team. As always, it's a community-driven event, so we're always open to suggestions and any ideas that you got, or if you want to speak, reach out to any of us. There's our kind of I should probably put some short links in, but I'm sure you can all read everybody's LinkedIn URL there. You can't click on them, but just give us a search on LinkedIn or hook us up on Twitter if you want to. And yeah, ask away. But like I say, it's a community event, so we're always open to any kind of suggestions or ideas or anything you think is suitable for these events. Like I say, we got some great speakers for you again in this event. So the Feb event, we've got Kristina joining us very shortly after I stop waffling on to talk to us around deploying microservices into AKS. Using ADO, so Azure DevOps, using those ADO environments, using multi-stage pipelines. So really looking forward to seeing that session from Kristina. It's great to say hello to her in the first place. If you're not following on Twitter, go and give her a follow. She's doing some fantastic stuff right across the community as well. So looking forward to that one, Kristina. We'll see you very soon. And then a little bit of a fanboy moment for myself, and I'm sure anybody over a certain age. We got the one and only Tim Warner. He's not joined in with us yet, but he'll be with us shortly. So yeah, for those that you don't know who Tim Warner is, he's probably I would say probably one of the most prolific tech trainers of the last decade or two. Matt, I mean, he's like I say, it's a fanboy moment. I remember.
Yeah.
My tech youth listening to CBT Nuggets by Tim Warner. So he's doing so well. He's a great trainer at the end of the day and a really great person. So Tim's going to come on and talk to us around Azure Trends for 2023. So really, really interested to see what Tim's got to say on that subject. So he'll be joining us soon as well. From a timings perspective, Kristina will be on very soon. I'll stop going on fairly imminently, and we'll catch up with Kristina. Tim around about 7:30-ish, and don't forget we've always got the quiz as well. So the quiz will be kicking off around about 8:15 GMT. So get your mobile phones or your web browsers at the ready and joining that. We'll have a couple of Amazon gift cards up for grabs. The usual housekeeping rules. As always, everybody, please be courteous to each other. There are no silly questions. We're here to learn. So any question springs to mind, please do use the chat channel. Stay on mute whilst the speakers are speaking, unless they invite you to come off mute, of course. If you want to use a chat channel at an appropriate point, I'm sure Kristina or Tim can invite you to speak, or at the end of the session, we'll have a little bit of a few minutes for some Q&A. And yeah, we love feedback. So if you've got any feedback, we'll put a link up at the end of the event. And yeah, if you've got any feedback for us, we'd love to hear it. And like I say, don't forget, don't leave instantly after Tim's session. Join us for the quiz. There's some prizes up for grabs. It only takes 10-15 minutes or so a little bit of fun at the end of the event then. And lastly, be interactive. Please use chat. Say hello to everybody, get to know each other, come off camera on camera if you want. Great to see everybody here again, and just enjoy the sessions. We're all here to learn. As always, quick shout out to our sponsors. Servant have been absolutely fantastic with us for the last 2.5 or so years since we've been running the virtual events. Great company based up north in Scotland, and they're great Microsoft partner as well. As you can see, they sponsor a number of UK-based user groups at the moment. And yeah, big shout out to the team up in Servant for all their support over the last couple of years. If you're interested in other user groups, the Welsh Azure user group is part of what is known as the Azure Tech Group community, which is on Meetup. If you do a search for, or I think if you go on Meetup and you see Azure user group, Welsh Azure user group, you can click that Azure Tech Group link and it'll give you this little map. So you can kind of find lots of user groups. And they're not just Azure user groups, they're tech groups right across the globe. So if you're interested in finding either, if you're not local to the UK or Wales, you can find events closer to you, and some of those might be hybrid or in person. But equally, we really appreciate it. So those of us that run these groups really appreciate the support. So if you have the time, it's always good to go and reach out to another user group and show them some love and support as well. So I'd encourage you to do that. And of course, you get more learnings and more chances to win prizes, which I know a few people, not naming any names that aren't in the room at the moment, like to do that as well. Another quick shout out for SQL Bits. This year is being run from the ICC in Wales on March the 14th. There are some paid days. There's a 5% discount for grabs there if you use the code UG5 Welsh Azure. And like I say, that's down the road from me, so I might pay a little visit myself for that one as well. So there we go. I'm going to stop waffling on, and I'm going to hand you over to Kristina, and we'll get started with the first session. So, Kristina, lovely to see you. I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John. Good to finally catch up a bit more live outside of Twitter as well. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to contribute to Welsh Azure.
Our pleasure.
Happy to be here. All right, so then if you're ready, I am ready. So I'm always excited to share the screen because, as I said to John earlier, I'm using a Linux machine in my personal time. So I hope you can see what you need to see. Yes, I may have missed my video, but I think that's okay. So hello everyone. Really happy that you were able to find some time and join today's meetup. So let me just increase this presentation. I don't have many slides. I do prefer focusing on demos. But today I'm gonna share some insights about Azure DevOps environments and how we can use that for deploying microservices and applications to Azure Kubernetes Service, also with help of Azure DevOps and Multistaged Azure pipelines. So just a few words about me before we start. I have recently, or in September last year, got an MVP in Microsoft Azure category, and I am based in Oslo, Norway, and working as a software architect a lot with Microsoft Azure. And I do love sharing the knowledge back and giving back to the tech community by blogging and co-organizing meetups, and also as a speaker. So that's one of the reasons why I am here. And I do love cats. So you may see quite a few pictures of cats in the presentation and in demo. So just embrace yourself. I hope you will still stay with me for the rest of the session, nevertheless. All right. So why am I here, and why do I want to talk about Azure DevOps environments and to show its capabilities? And one of the reasons for that is that nowadays there are a lot of ways that you can deploy applications to Kubernetes and specifically to Azure Kubernetes Service. And what you're going to choose in that vast space of tools really depends on what your organization requirements are and what kind of use cases you have. And choosing a tool depends on many factors. So it depends on the amount of services you may have and how complex those services are. It may depend on what security requirements and limitations you may have in your organization. For example, what set of tools are you allowed to use or not? And for example, introducing a new tool, what will it imply in terms of the routines and policies and processes you need to go through, for example, from the security perspective. It also depends on the readiness of your organization, on how many resources you have and what kind of competence they have in Kubernetes, in containers, and kind of maintaining the whole solution and software development lifecycle. And it also depends on the level of competence of the resources that will be involved. And there are many more factors that may affect the choice of the tools. And one of the goals I find also important to think about and have in the back of the head is to look at which tools you already have, and are any of those tools, do they have a potential to be utilized even more? Because it's all about, it is also worth thinking about utilizing what you already have to its maximum capacity. And many organizations do use Azure DevOps. And what I have seen as well, that not extremely many have heard about Azure DevOps environments. So it's good to spread a bit of knowledge on what Azure DevOps environments can be useful for. So what are Azure DevOps environments? What it basically represents is that it represents a location or a target where you want to deploy your applications. So for instance, Azure Kubernetes Service can be a location where you will be deploying multiple applications. What is good about Azure DevOps environments also is that it does not necessarily need to be AKS, even though AKS is kind of natively integrated and has many more things in the background that may be coming out of the box, but you do have a capability to use any other Kubernetes distribution as a target or as an Azure DevOps environment. Each Azure DevOps environment consists of something called resources, and every resource represents an application that you want to deploy. So the environment itself is a place, a location where you want to deploy multiple resources or multiple applications. And the resource types that are supported by Azure DevOps environment, as you can see also on the right-hand side here, it can be Kubernetes resources, so applications that will be deployed to a Kubernetes cluster, but you can also deploy to virtual machines. So this is also one of the types that is supported. And earlier, when I was presenting this in some earlier meetups, I also got questions about, okay, can an Azure DevOps environment be shared across projects in Azure DevOps? And the fact is that, unfortunately, at this point, Azure DevOps environments are project scoped resources, which means that normally you are not able to share a single Azure DevOps environment across multiple projects. So you would need to create an environment per project, even though it will be targeting the same location. But there are some workarounds or some scripts and possible solutions that the community has provided to be able to work around this for virtual machine types of resources, but not for Kubernetes resources at this point. And as we will see shortly, if you want to use Azure DevOps environments, you could easily implement that as part of your existing build and deployment workflow in Azure pipelines. And there may be multiple reasons where Azure DevOps environments would be a good choice. For example, if you already are using Azure DevOps environments, if you are just on the journey of adopting Kubernetes, it could be good to start relatively lightweight, where the learning curve may be lower and where the transition may be smoother. So Azure DevOps provides you this opportunity where you could use the same tool both for development, for building the applications, but also for deployment. And especially if you don't have that many applications to begin with, this can be a really good choice that can help you to start faster. The user interface is familiar. So if you are not the only one who would need to get access to get an overview of your applications running in Kubernetes and AKS, what the status, the current health of those applications are, if you need to get out some logs, you can use the same UI that you are familiar with from before, that you are using for software development, for building the applications. So you don't even need to use kubectl or to log into the cluster or to go to the Azure portal to get out those logs. You can just go in Azure DevOps to another page and get those application logs out to easily and quickly check what's happening, which also helps you have that straightforward initial diagnostic that can help you quickly figure out if there is anything that is really visible that may be the reason for errors when issues start happening. And already built-in security and access control capabilities with role-based access control, with granular permissions, that already is in place in Azure DevOps. You could apply the same security controls also on Azure DevOps environments and the resources that are part of those environments. So a quick overview of the highlights we're going to see in the demo shortly. So what what Azure DevOps environments could provide you in terms of functionality is that you can get an overview of the deployment history for different applications and the connections of those deployments to the changes that have been done. So you could see the pull requests, the work items, the change set history that is connected to the deployment that is currently up and running in an AKS cluster. You have that possibility to define and control access both for users, user groups, and pipelines, both on the Azure DevOps environment level and also on individual resources. You could have additional policies and validations in place. For example, if you want to deploy to production, or to pre-production environments, you could introduce additional checks, which we will see shortly, that can perform some automatic changes, some automatic verifications, or if you're not quite ready to have a fully automated deployment or like a full-fledged continuous deployment, then you could use these policies to kind of have that gate in place before performing the deployment itself to a specific environment. And you have that opportunity to get that quick diagnostic through getting the initial resource details and the important metadata like the state of the resources, and getting that application logs out through Azure DevOps UI. And it can easily be included in a pipeline and existing pipeline definition to have both the build and deployment stage in the same place. So that was all the theory I feel you needed to know to learn more about Azure DevOps environments, but we like learning by doing, and therefore I have a demo that I would like to show you. So for this demo, in order to spare some time, I had to do some initial preparations, but I think that should still be okay for you to understand how to start quickly using that. So what I have done is that I have created an AKS cluster. For those who are familiar with Witcher, you probably know what Cairmorn is. So that's what I called our AKS cluster for today. And then back in here in Azure DevOps, I have a separate repo where I have the source code for the application that I would like to deploy to AKS with help of Azure DevOps environments. So here, let me just maybe increase it a little bit. We have the source code in the source. So it's a simple ASP.NET 7 web application that is, of course, a cat encyclopedia. So we will see shortly what that actually means. Apart from the source code, we have a Docker file that will help us containerize the application that we want to deploy. And we have the code that will create a Helm chart. So we have the source code that will help us create a Helm chart out of the containerized application, and we can then use Helm, this Helm chart, for quickly deploying that application to AKS. If you would like to learn more about Helm, which is a package management tool that can help you deploy containerized applications to AKS, you can afterwards check the resources that I will share with you in the end of the session. And finally, we have a YAML definition for the build pipeline that will be used in order to build the application. And as the session states, it's a multi-staged pipeline. So we have one stage that is meant for building. So this stage will build the application, ensure that the versioning of the application is proper with Git version. It will build a Docker image. I have commented out some stages that are related to security, which you can also check afterwards if you would like to play around with it. And it will also package the prepared or built container image of that application, and will make that Helm chart available for us. And then the second stage is deployment stage, where we will be using our Azure DevOps environments in order to deploy that Helm chart that was prepared in the previous stage for us here in the deploy task of this build. So this is basically the repo that we will be using. But if you, let's say that we have the source code for the application in place, how would you start? So in Azure DevOps, in the pipelines section, there is a subsection called environments, and this is where you will be defining the Azure DevOps environments and the resources that should be part of those. So as you can see here, I have already created an environment just to ensure that we spare some time, but typically you would start by clicking the new environment and then providing some name and description that will also make it easier for others to understand where the resources belong. And here I would provide some recommendations. You need to think about the naming convention. Like the way I prefer or recommend doing that is that you typically would provide a name that consists of multiple things. Like, for example, the first would represent the Kubernetes distribution, like AKS, then some unique identifier of the cluster that this environment is targeting, and then the environment type, if it's a development environment, staging, pre-prod, production, then it will make it quite well structured and easy to differentiate. And even though Azure DevOps does allow you to mix the different Kubernetes or like resources targeting different Kubernetes clusters or even virtual machines inside a single environment, we will shortly see that. No, we will actually not see that, but I will mention what if you do that, you may end up in naming conflicts, because if you have a single environment and you create two resources where the resources use the same namespace but are targeting different Kubernetes clusters, you will not be allowed to create those two resources because the name of the resource needs to be equal to the namespace. And if you attempt to use the same namespace inside the same environment, you will get a naming conflict. So both for avoiding those conflicts, for avoiding those errors, and also keeping it separated and cleaner, it is a good idea to look at an Azure DevOps environment as a location representing a single cluster, for example, because then it will also make it much easier for others who may come in and kind of try to figure out where they can find the resource and how the things are structured. It will make it much easier for them to understand it. So let's just take a look at this. For example, if I want to say that I want to target an AKS cluster that is called Caremorn, and I want to, for example, have, let's just say dev2, then I can add some description that others could, that will make it easier for others to understand what this environment represents. And here you can provide the type of the resources that you want this environment to target. If you provide none, then you will need to figure it out afterwards when you create a new resource in that environment. But if you choose, for example, Kubernetes, then you will need to create your first resource as part of the environment creation. And here Azure DevOps will help us and first try to get a provider. So here you could choose Azure Kubernetes Service and another Kubernetes distribution. So as I said, you don't necessarily need to use AKS. You get a choice to choose a generic provider, which will represent other Kubernetes distributions. And now I can choose one of the Azure subscriptions, and then it will pick up, retrieve all the clusters, all the AKS clusters that I have available in that subscription. So currently I have the only one. And then I need to choose the namespace, which will represent the place where I want to deploy my resource or my application. So as you can see here, I have a cat encyclopedia namespace because I have already created this resource prior to this meeting. I can also choose another existing namespace if I want, for example, where the application is not yet deployed, but I have created namespace earlier, so I just want to hook it up here in the aftermath. But I can also create a new namespace. And what will happen then is that Azure DevOps will not only create a resource here in the Azure DevOps environment, but it will also create the respective namespace in the AKS cluster. And it will create a service connection that will connect Azure DevOps with that AKS cluster and with that namespace. And once you have done that, you can just click validate and create, and the resource and the environment will be created for you. So if we go to this environment that I have created here, as you can see, I have two resources. One of them is Get Encyclopedia. The other one represents the WordPress application. And both of them are targeting Kubernetes. So I can just also go to the service connections just to show you kind of the good thing from the security perspective in terms of isolating those resources from each other, is if we go to the service connections here, we can see that two service connections were created by Azure DevOps for us that connect to this Care More and AKS cluster, to this Azure DevOps environment on this cluster, and to this namespace. And if we go to the cluster itself, I will be using kubectl here just to illustrate the point. If we take a look at service accounts, if I say kubectl get service account in Cat Encyclopedia namespace where my application is deployed, we can see that a service account was created for us that connects to Azure DevOps. And now if I want to check what permissions does this service account have, I could say kubectl get role binding in Cat Encyclopedia namespace. And here we can see that role binding is a way to define which account has what kind of permissions in which namespace. So these permissions are not applicable outside of the namespace where the role binding is defined. So as you can see, the service account that was created for us, for Azure DevOps, has cluster admin permissions on Cat Encyclopedia namespace. So this means that this account is not allowed to do anything else other than the job it needs to do in this specific namespace, which is to deploy the application we need. So if we were to just take a quick test and say, okay, can I find any cluster role bindings that are connected to this service account? Because cluster role bindings typically give you access on the cluster level. As you can see, there are many system accounts, metrics, CSI, but nothing that is related to AZ Dev. So this means that it's only a role binding inside a specific namespace is created, which also separates the different resources targeting the same cluster, which is a good thing. So if we go back to the Azure DevOps environment, as I said, you could see the deployment history. Right now, we can see that everything has been deployed successfully. So we could go to deployments. We could see the deployment history. We could even filter on the resource. So, for example, if I want to see the deployment history just for the WordPress application, I could do that. I can open it up. And here I get some initial information that can be really helpful. Otherwise, I would need to go log into the AKS cluster, do kubectl get deployment, for example, or kubectl describe deployment, or get pod, or do a set of other commands. And developers, for example, if they need to get access to get some logs, they can avoid doing that or understanding how to do that. They can just go in here and check it out. And here you can get some initial information about what kind of application this is, how it's managed in the Kubernetes cluster, what version of the container image is being used, how many pods are running. So if you have multiple pods, you will get that information here. And if I click on those pods, I can also get an information about the different pods. So if I had multiple pods, which are basically the copies of the application, the replicas that you want to split the load across, I would get them here in this overview. And I can get some information about which restart policy is set, what is the current status of this pod, is it ready, are the containers ready to accept traffic, and if the pod was successfully scheduled. And in the logs, as I said, you can get application logs here that will basically allow you to do this directly from Azure DevOps. It is not streaming live. You need to do a refresh if you want to get the latest logs, unfortunately, but still, you get this easy access to initial logs, which we will see shortly is really helpful. And YAML section also represents the resource definition that can also give you some information that can be useful. For example, when the update happened, when the pod was scheduled, you can see if resource and request limits are set, for example, on the deployment, what kind of health probes are being in use. So you could quickly check it directly from here. And then apart from that, you could also see the services. And service in Kubernetes is a resource that is standing in front of all the pods and accepts traffic and distributes traffic depending on what pods are currently healthy and are ready to take to accept the requests. So you could also get information about the services that are standing in front of your application, which cluster IP is being used, and so on. So you get quite a lot of information from here, which can also let you do initial investigation from a single place. So if we take a look at the pipeline that I have recently showed you here, I have done a preparational deployment for this session. As you can see, the multiple stages are also represented here. So if we open a deployment stage and check where the application was deployed, we can just open it just to see how the application looks like. And as I said, very simple, but a cat encyclopedia that will generate a random fact or cat fact and a random image for you. And if you want to spread some more love, you can some more love for cats, you can just click this button here and do that. So now let's say I want to do some damage. I want to simulate that things go wrong in an application so that we can see how we can easily check what may be going wrong. So in order to do that, I have created a bad health endpoint that I would like to check in here. So let's go to the Helm chart, to the deployment definition that will be used to create an application deployment inside the cluster. And I will just do a small hack here, which will simulate a failing application during the deployment process. So here I can commit, and I will just say update deployment YAML to create some damage. And of course, if you have any work items, you could also link that, which will also be helpful when you check out the deployment and change set history. So let's commit this. I'm of course committing to master bypassing pull requests, so don't do that in an enterprise life scenario. All right, let's trigger a new build. It will take a minute or two to deploy, and while this is happening, I also wanted to just let you know that if you would like to test it for yourself, I will share the link to the GitHub repo, but you can also create a free account in Azure DevOps for Azure DevOps services. And then if you're using their cloud solution, you get most of the Azure DevOps functionality out of the box, apart from the pipelines. I think you could, there is a small fee you may need to use unless you have open source projects that you want to use it for, so that you could use Microsoft hosted agents in order to build that. So this kind of will also, if you want to experiment with it on your spare time, you could use that. And there are quite a few Azure DevOps labs that I will share also in the resources afterwards that that you could use in order to get more familiar with Azure DevOps if you haven't worked with it earlier. All right, let's see. While it's building a Docker image, I would like also to quickly show what will be happening in the cluster itself while we're watching. Let's try to retrieve all the pods that are currently running in this Cat Encyclopedia namespace, and let's watch them live. Let's see what will happen now. Now we're getting into the deployment stage. See. Also, if you want to publicly expose an application on AKS to test it out quickly, you could use an HTTP application routing add-on, which I am currently using, which will create such a funky name for you here, but at least you will not need to set up a lot of tools to be a lot of services in addition on top of AKS to quickly expose your application. You could just enable that, and I will also share the link afterwards. So now the deployment is happening. So let's see if we will get some crash loop backup status in here. As you can see, something started happening. So the application is not quite coming up, and it already has restarted one time. So something is definitely going on. And already now we will be able to see that in Azure DevOps environment. So if we open the environments page and go to, let's see, if we go to resources, we can see that something is happening. It's already marked as red even before the pipeline has failed. So we can go in here. We can see that the previous pod is still running thanks to Helm, because then we could ensure that we are doing a zero downtime deployment. And we can see that this newer version has something bad in it. So here, if we go to the pods, we could see that there is something that is wrong, and we can go to the logs and see if we will be able to retrieve anything. As I said, we probably need to, there we go. Something's happening. Let's give it one more refresh. As you can see, we are getting some messages here. Something terrible happened. I cannot load any cats. So I would need to go and see if I need to fix anything. So I could go back to the resource. Let's see, if we go back to the resource here, to the deployment, we could, for example, go and see what changes have happened. So I could go to that specific commit and see what I need to fix. So let's see now if we want to fix that. Probably I would want to add some additional validations, since I may have team members that are not yet ready for doing everything fully automatically. I may want to create a validation gate. So here on the environment level, as I said, we have an opportunity to define who has access and what kind of access to the environment in general. So you could define who at all will be able to see this section. But you could also go to a specific resource. Let's see. Oh, sorry. I'll just do like this. And here in the security stage, in the security page, we can also define that for this specific environment and the resources in this environment, only these people and user groups are allowed to, for example, read or change these resources. But I can also allow the pipelines, which pipelines are allowed to target these environments and these resources. And by default, no pipelines are allowed. So if you're creating this for the first time, you would need to give an explicit approval that this pipeline is allowed to perform the deployment unless you add it here beforehand. So this is where you can configure the access control to the Azure DevOps environments and resources in those environments. But if you want to introduce some additional approvals and checks, you can do this in the approvals and checks section. So let's say I would want to create a gate with an approval from some resources, which could be a good idea when you just are starting out on this journey. So here I will add myself, since I'm the only one in this organization all by myself. I would also need to allow myself to approve my runs, and I can set a timeout. So if no one has approved it for a day, the check will just time out and the deployment will be canceled. So let's just add this here and go back, let's see, and change this back to the healthy state. So I will change this health probe again to the healthy state and commit again. So if we go back to the pipeline, we can see that it has failed, and we will just trigger a new pipeline. And since I'm simulating a lot of things, I just need to cancel, let's see, if we get the pods again, we will just need to remove this, because it will take some time until it is cleaned out, and if it's not, then the new deployment may fail. So I will just roll back to revision 1. Hopefully that will work. That did. All right. So now, while the other deployment is running, I would also like to show you another interesting check that you could configure for Azure DevOps environments. So if we go back to the approvals and checks, here you could add a check that is called required template. And for this, I have also created a WordPress repository where we have an, let's see, that is called another repo. But if you have used the templates in Azure DevOps before, these build templates provide you an opportunity to granularly define which build and deployment tasks are allowed for a specific repo in a specific pipeline. So you could just create a build pipeline in Azure DevOps, and then you could say that this set of tasks are allowed in this template. And then you could use those templates for usability and to also prevent or have some security restrictions, so that no one can come in and ingest some malicious tasks in the existing build. So you, with help of such templates, could restrict that capability. And in order to validate it additionally, if you are planning to deploy applications that are using such build templates, you could create a check that will define which templates are allowed to perform deployment with. So here I could add a template for a specific repo that is allowed to be used for deployment in this Azure DevOps environment. So here I can choose the repository host. I need to provide the repository name, which in this case is another repo. Here by default it says master, but as you know, the branch naming has recently changed, so we need to update it to the proper naming, main. And then we would need to provide the path to the required YAML template. So here is the path, templates deploy AKS. As you can see, I have also created an evil deploy AKS template that we will see will not be allowed to deploy once this check is created. So if we do this and create, we can try to deploy this WordPress application, but we will first try to target. Before we do that, as you can see, we have come close to the deployment stage, and now we have that check where we need to approve that has been enforced. So now I can go inside here, check the changes, and reject or approve it. And once this is done, only then the deployment will happen. So while the deployment is happening, if we try to run the WordPress deployment, and here we will try to target the evil Azure pipeline template, then we will be able to see if we will be allowed to perform this deployment. And this should happen pretty fast, because here there are not so many tasks that have been implemented. Let's see. Right, so now we can see that no checks have passed. First of all, we would need to review, because we have for this environment, we have currently configured 2 checks, one that will require an approval from me, which I can approve, for example. But still, it will be re-evaluated if the second check is passed. So currently it's showing still 0 out of 2. But as you can see here, the required template failed has been triggered, which means that since our build pipeline was targeting a malicious template or the template that is non-compliant, we will not be able to use that. So if we go back and try to fix this, we could just go back to settings and target the correct YAML file and try to rerun it. Let's see. Yes, now we can go back and see. 1 of 2 checks have passed. So as you can see, now the template is correct. The template is compliant with the checks that we have set up, and now we can successfully deploy. So if we go back to our cat encyclopedia deployment, we could see that the new deployment has been successful, and we can even go back here. We can check it. It's working nicely. And if we go back to the environments, we can see that the latest one is running nicely and is running on the newer version. So everything looks good. All right, so that may have been a lot of information. I can understand that. So you will get access to those resources if you also would like to try it out for yourself. If we quickly will round this up and sum it up, what would be the considerations that you should have in the back of your heads if you will start playing around with Azure DevOps environments? As I said, naming convention is not only important in the development stage, but also when it comes to the build and deployment stages as well. And there may be other teams, other team members, and even less technical resources, like, for example, product managers that would like to go in and check, get an overview of what applications are currently running, or if anything needs to be followed up, and keeping the structure clean and the naming convention standardized would help lots, not only for you, but also for the others who may be accessing the same resources. One thing I haven't showed is the referencing Azure DevOps environments in the pipeline. So if we go back to the build pipeline file, I just want to quickly show you how would the pipeline know which Azure DevOps environment it needs to target. So if we go to the deployment stage here, we can see that there is a special type of job, which is called deployment job, which has a property called environment. And this is the one that tells Azure DevOps that, hey, I am targeting an Azure DevOps environment. Here you can either hard code the name of the Azure DevOps environment, or you could reference an environment from a variable group, which will make it easier also to update the environment if you at some point decide to to migrate to another Azure DevOps environment, then you would need to update it in one place instead of going into every single stage, build stage and deployment stage, and in every single pipeline and change it. You could just reference it from a variable group. And then it would know that it needs to target this Azure DevOps environment and this resource in that environment. So referencing the Azure DevOps environment like this through a variable group that you are importing on the top of the pipeline definition would make it much easier to make the changes. And if we go in the pipelines section back to the library here, we can see that this is the variable group that we are importing. And here you can have different Azure DevOps environment variables targeting different clusters depending on what your needs are. Finally, having approvals and checks like the ones I have showed you could be really useful if you want to have some additional checks that need to be run. And you can even introduce Azure functions, for example, that could attempt to do some additional follow-ups before the deployment is happening. This could be really beneficial for you to ensure that the changes that are being deployed are of good enough quality and follow the policies that you have established. And also, there are possibilities to migrate to new Azure DevOps environments. For example, if you are moving all your applications to a new cluster, you would need to migrate to a new Azure DevOps environment. You could either do this through UI, but you could also utilize the REST API that is available. Or I will also share some resources with automation scripts that could easily help you to do that by just running the script. There is some support for Azure DevOps environments in Terraform as well, and in Bicep, I think, if I'm not mistaken, but it is quite limited. So you can't create that much in it. You can create like the environment to provide the name and what type of environment that is, but all in all, it is much more limited than once you configure it with help of a script or through the UI. And this is the QR code to the GitHub repo where all these resources are available and all the learning resources that you could use to familiarize yourself a bit more with it. I also have a few blog posts where I wrote in more detail the different ways you could group the resources, the pros and cons of those. So do check it out. Right now, this may be a lot of information if you haven't worked with it before, but hopefully the resources in that GitHub repo can give you even more information to work with going forward. And what I can say, what we have seen in the projects that I've been working with, this helped to have quite a smooth transition and quickly start, especially when you have a few microservices that you would want to deploy in a standardized way quickly to the Kubernetes clusters, to the AKS clusters. And if your organization may not necessarily be ready for GitOps approach yet, where everything is fully automated and the clusters are pulling the changes themselves from the repo instead of you explicitly pushing the changes, your organization may not be ready for that yet. And that's where Azure DevOps environments could really help you start quickly and help you transition in a relatively good and not that stressful space while you are getting more mature with using containers and Kubernetes. So do check it out. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. I'll be very happy to help and talk about it a bit more. I think I'm even on time.
No, that was amazing. Thanks a lot, Kristina. That was superb. I'm just checking the chat now. I don't think we've got any questions, but you had me looking around my room earlier on when I could hear a cat meowing. So I don't know if that was a real cat or if it was the container there. But,
I hope you haven't heard that, but you did. That may have been container.
Me on work calls all the time. I get a cat walking past the back of my head. So
yeah, fortunately, my husband realized that and he closed the door.
No,
There
that
was
was
a wise choice.
fantastic. Great session as well. You broke it down really brilliantly well. So, yeah, I guess I can't see any questions in the chat there now, but I guess if you're sticking around, Kristina, for the quiz, you're more than welcome to take part after Tim's session now. But
yeah, I'd love that. And
yeah.
don't hesitate to just ping me afterwards as well. I'll be happy to have a chat about it or anything else.
Really appreciate. If everybody wants to come off mute or use the emoticons and share the love for the session. Thanks again, Kristina. That was awesome stuff.
Thank you so much.
Getting a lot of cat love in the chat now, I think I can see. But,
so awesome. What a wonderful group of people gathered here today.
Thanks, Kristina. Right, I tell you what we will do. I can see Mr. Warner has joined in, so I think we will not delay and we will hand straight over to Tim Warner. Like I said, Tim, before you joined earlier on, I was having another fanboy moment, and your dulcet tones over the last 20 years of my tech career have been ingrained in my brain. So, look, really super to have you at the Welsh Azure User Group, Tim. Thanks for giving up your time today. Really looking forward to your session and welcome.
Thank you so much, John. And Chris, thanks for your session as well. Speaking of dulcet tones, I really enjoyed your speaker voice. And again, to agree with some people in the chat, any presentation that includes cats and or memes has my attention, period. You could have been presenting on, different kinds of light bulbs as far as I'm concerned. So let's see here. Let me share my screen. Hang on just a second. I'm going to hopefully select the correct one. All right. John, can you confirm that you see my slide deck?
Got you. Yeah, got you coming through. Thanks, Tim.
All right. Thanks. Well, formally, hello, everybody. My name's Tim Warner. I'm so happy to present to you. I never will not be jazzed at this notion of teaching and presenting and collaborating with people all around the world. It's just the best thing ever. I'm coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee, Music City, USA, as it's called. I do have my guitar nearby, but I know time is at a premium here. So we're going to be discussing trends in Microsoft Azure for 2023 and beyond. Now, I do want to say, by means of a little disclaimer, that although I am a Microsoft full-time employee and happy to be so, I'm here on my own behalf and I'm speaking strictly my own opinions, my own observations, having been a Microsoft specialist for about, I hate to say it, 25 years. Whew, how time flies. And having been with Azure since the old service management API days back in the dark ages. So what am I hoping that you'll walk away from this presentation with? Well, I'm hoping that you'll come away with a greater appreciation of big picture trends in Azure. I mean, with so many services, what are there, 200 odd services in the Azure portfolio right now? And that would just be services that are in generally available status, not public or private preview. What is most important to focus on? Whether you're building a career in Azure, whether you're already an experienced developer or IT pro and you just want to broaden and deepen your skills, maybe you're not a technical professional and you just want to know what's most important to focus on. That's the idea. My rationale was I picked services that are as universal across Azure as possible. I also picked services that are relevant not just to Azure, but also the other major cloud providers like Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud. The way I look at it, it's, I hope, becoming the standard for a business to be multi-cloud as opposed to single cloud. After all, the ultimate layer of redundancy would be protecting against the entire Azure global cloud going dark, which can happen if Azure AD goes down, for example. So cross-service, cross-cloud, embraced by the Microsoft technical community. Is it a service that did experience a strong show of support right from the beginning and continuing to this day? That's a good sign. And then, of course, importantly, not a shiny object, but an Azure service that actually addresses current generation needs and problems, particularly with security. So I've got one eye on my presentation, one eye on my other monitor, looking at the time. I guess I've got about 45 minutes, and I want to make sure to reserve lots and lots and whole bunches of time for questions. So I'm still, even after a year of working with teams all day, every day, I'm still kind of clumsy with it. I'm having a hard time getting a chat window up on the screen as well. So, John, if you would be so kind, if there's any questions that come into the chat, please stop me in my tracks, would you? And I'll also reserve time at the end because I want to make sure to address anything that you've got on your mind with all this stuff. As far as the session materials go, you can download a PDF version of this slide deck by pointing your browser to timw.info AZ Trends. Don't mind the branding on the first slide. I'm actually reusing a slide deck I used with my home Azure technology group here in Nashville, but it's the same set of slides that I'm presenting right now. timw.info AZ Trends is the short address, and I'll give that to you at the end of the presentation as well, if anybody misses it the first time around. Okay, so let's get right into it here. I figured because I'm the kind of person who gets annoyed when I hit a news site and they start burying the point down several screens. Oh, that really infuriates me. Let's get the trends right on the screen in a nutshell now, and then we'll spend the rest of our time going through each one. Now, these 6 trends I picked out, are there only 6? Depends on who you talk to. Are these trends presented in any of my personal order of preference? Absolutely not. It's pseudo-random, all right? So we're going to start with private endpoint, Azure Policy, Azure Arc, Microsoft Artificial Intelligence or AI services, the Microsoft Azure Deployment Services, and hybrid cloud identity. I think that checks the boxes as far as broad services, cross-cloud, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud services, services that are getting a lot of love from Microsoft from a development and promotion standpoint. Why? Because they're getting a lot of love in the community being embraced by customers. So there it is in a nutshell. And I also have these top line themes just from a elevator pitch perspective. What I think are the biggest trends in Azure now are number 1, private access. Thinking of Microsoft Azure as a commercial multi-tenant cloud. How can a business, with cost being paramount, you don't have the money necessarily to go out and buy or lease a bunch of Azure Stack racks to have your own private Azure. How can you use the Azure Commercial Cloud to store your business's proprietary data in a way that is as single tenant as possible? So we have the idea of the private link service, for example. Next, this push, embrace, and emphasis on Microsoft's part toward hybrid cloud, multi-cloud. You might be interested in mobile device management or MDM with Microsoft Intune and the Microsoft Defender for Cloud Suite. You might be interested in Microsoft Sentinel, the SIM SOAR platform, or Microsoft Defender for Cloud itself. You might be interested in configuration management. What I think is so compelling here is Azure's support just right out of the gate for non-Microsoft operating systems. The notion of supporting your legacy, I say legacy, your physical servers in addition to your virtual machines, regardless of where they are, whether they're in AWS running in the EC2 service, whether they're running on premises in your local data centers, not just in Microsoft's own Hyper-V, but also VMware. Under Satya, it's just a totally different world. I mean, I think back to earlier in my career, just a number of years ago, the idea of Microsoft embracing competitors, embracing alternatives, and supporting their customers with these alternatives was pretty much unthinkable. Amazon. So it's really a hybrid cloud, multi-cloud world. And lastly, how can you miss ChatGPT when you're looking in the news nowadays? Microsoft and OpenAI forming this partnership. I am just over the moon happy about myself. And we're going to see much, much greater integration with AI services. Now, that partnership is just one facet of the gem, and we'll get more into that as we get into each section of this presentation. So, any preliminary questions, John, pop up? Again, I can't see the chat.
No, nothing at the minute, Tim. You're all good.
All right, thank you, sir. Okay, let's dive into these specific points. First, private endpoint. What's the user story behind this, or a common user story? How can we access our Azure-based data? Customer data, database data, storage account data, whatever it might be. privately without transiting over the dangerous public internet. Now, historically, you're going to pay a big premium for private single tenant service in Azure. I mentioned Azure Stack. That's definitely still a thing. You have, for instance, an Azure App Service, you have the App Service environment. So there has historically been ways to do private access, but really not so much for data services specifically. So let me bring out my drawing tools here. There we go. Let me erase that. What you have on this screen is a diagram, a diagram from the Azure Architecture Center. And you'll notice in the lower left corner, I give a short link whenever I borrow an image from there. And that's good because if you're not aware of the Azure Architecture Center, I would definitely want you to be aware of it because it's one of a handful of Microsoft doc sites that are more prescriptive. And I don't mean proscriptive like telling you what to do, but really offering you proven practice guidance. So if you don't know about private endpoint, what this allows you to do is take an Azure data service like a general purpose storage account, like an Azure Key Vault, like an Azure SQL database server, like a Cosmos DB account, these core data products, and embed them natively into an Azure virtual network, which you probably know is an air-gapped cloud-based Ethernet LAN. And therefore, Azure will create a virtual network interface for that private endpoint. And you then can interact with that service either partially or entirely off internet. The way the trend works is you'll see it's going to be specific per service. But there's the resource firewall, for example, on an Azure storage account that allows you to create exceptions. For example, you could come in primarily through a private non-internet routable IP address on the private endpoint and also make exceptions for public IP addresses on a case-by-case basis. Or you could turn off using, again, the public firewall, which is essentially an IP access list. You could turn off inbound internet altogether and come in exclusively on that private endpoint. You might wonder, well, wait a minute. Well, what about in a hybrid cloud? If we have an express route or a site-to-site virtual private network, will this work and how does it work? Well, the answer is yes, it does absolutely work. Your question would be, how do you resolve that private IP that's coming from a subnet on that particular virtual network? In this diagram you see, actually, I'm getting a little annoyed with Snagit here. Next time Snagit pops up, I'm going to try to kill that process. Anyway, it's about name resolution, isn't it? And again, speaking of trends, another service I'd like you to keep in your proverbial shirt pocket is called the Azure Private DNS Private Resolver. You see, because again, I'm trying to calibrate as I'm talking because I don't want to over-present or under-present. But let's say that you've got a person or process on-prem who needs to write or read from this storage account that has a private endpoint. Now, you could kick it old school and just use a hosts file to map this public DNS name to the private IP address. But, you know, we're going to want to use DNS because if that private IP address were to change, we don't want to mess with it. And with your connection strings, let's go DNS, right? Historically, up until the Azure Private DNS Private Resolver came about, there is a fair amount of fiddling, to use the UK term, in order to sort this. You'd need to configure, well, you still do need to configure conditional DNS forwarding on-prem so that any calls to blob.core.windows.net would need to transit your VPN or your ExpressRoute circuit. And then you would need some DNS forwarder VM to communicate with the Azure provided DNS service, which ultimately will look up the private link in a private DNS zone that you've got configured. The private resolver service makes it so you don't have to host a separate DNS forwarder VM in Azure. So again, it's not too bad, really, as far as fiddling and all of that stuff is concerned. You could get by with a hosts file if you really needed to, although that's certainly not an enterprise solution. But in terms of pure cost efficiency, wow. I mean, yes, you're going to pay in a hybrid cloud for that ExpressRoute circuit, which are not cheap, or a site-to-site VPN. But even in the absence of that, if you were to use a jump host, for example, to come into your virtual network infrastructure, you could go across peerings with no problems and communicate with those Azure SQL databases, those Synapse Analytics workspaces, whatever. There are a number of services that support private endpoint. And you can communicate with these bidirectionally without, worry about transiting over the internet. It's a really big deal. And to Kristina's point earlier about AKS, private endpoint also has a feature where you can take an entire load balanced service like an AKS cluster, and you can embed that privately using private link as well. So there it is. I've called the private resolver out by name on this slide, and let's proceed. What's Azure policy? Well, here the user story is, how can we prevent, say, our colleagues, our fellows who are working in our Azure subscriptions, from doing things like deploying VMs that are too big, that are incorrectly configured, that don't have consistent naming or taxonomic tags, or they've been deployed to unauthorized regions. All of the core governance questions. How can we do that? We can use role-based access control to give or deny somebody the ability to do the deployment in the first place. But for those who should be able to deploy, how can we put guardrails around their environment? And that's really the main use case with Azure policy. I don't like this particular graphic. I think it's too complicated. What I'm just going to say at this point is that if you're not into Azure policy yet, please cross that bridge, attain that learning curve, however you want to describe it. Let me quickly demo this. Let me jump over to Edge. I'm not on my usual computer, which is why I'm so clumsy here. Let me go over to Edge. There we go. I'm already in the portal. And let's just jump over briefly to the policy console because I want to show you a couple things there. From a top-line perspective, policy starts with these JSON definitions. And in practice, you're going to roll a bunch of related definitions into what's called an initiative. Initiatives you could look at as a container or a folder that wrangles those multiple related individual policy definitions and allows you to assign the initiative once and track compliance from a higher level of abstraction as opposed to individual policies. I'm also getting some latency here. You know the so-called demo gods? It's part of life for any technical presenter. Well, I'm trying to load up what's called the built-ins library. Yeah, we're having some problem. There we go. At least for a moment, it showed up. It's not that big of a deal, like I said. These policies are extensible. Now, it's not like you can write a policy just out of thin air. Under the hood, the resource provider, let's say you were interested in protecting VMs so that you could deploy only to authorized regions. There's going to be a built-in for that, and you can make a clone of that built-in and you can modify it. But ultimately, you have to work with what are called the aliases or the properties of the underlying resource. And that would be up to each engineering team at Microsoft. They define what properties they want to alias up into policy. So another trend here, I think we're finally there. Let me go over to category. You can see that the built-ins have an enormous number of categories that cover different resource providers and use cases. I want to come down into the Gs and look at guest configuration, because another important trend for you to be aware of, specifically if you've used PowerShell desired state configuration or DSC for config management, that is really, it's not that it's going away, but it's evolving completely into a service called Azure Auto Manage Machine Configuration. Now, you probably know that Microsoft loves to change and rechange and rebrand. In fact, I saw in the news this morning, Yammer is being totally revamped and renamed. No surprise. But the guest configuration is another one of those things that's evolved its name. Basically, what we've got here is instead of desired state configuration being built into PowerShell, it's been ripped out actually. And now the latest builds of PowerShell don't have the desired state configuration bits. Instead, the idea is that you onboard the Linux and Windows Server machines that you want to do config management for into Azure Auto Manage. And at last check, it was free. you'll always want to look up. I always recommend students and customers just do a Google or Bing search for Azure space service name space pricing, and then you can hit the pricing page for a confirmation. But notice that these policy definitions all go inside the machine. They're dealing with group policy settings and registry settings. So I want you to see that Azure policy is not only allowing you to put governance guardrails on things like Azure deployments and the state of your Azure resources, but it also goes into hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, and with this guest configuration / Azure Auto Managed Machine configuration, you're going inside the guest OS and you're able to do lower level config management. So I want you to think of Azure policy as potentially an all-up hybrid cloud, multi-cloud service for your higher level governance, things like deployment and resource state, and also within those virtual machines specifically, right down to the OS and environment variable and registry state, making sure that you're preventing drift and staying in compliance. There's a lot to policy, and that's an understatement for sure. So let's go back to PowerPoint here and let's proceed to the next one here, Azure Arc, which is definitely related to everything I just mentioned, as a matter of fact. The user story here is how can we begin to centralize our management in Azure? You know, you want to think about, are you going to stay on-prem if you're primarily a Microsoft shop with, say, System Center products? Or no, that's not so tenable now that we're reaching into Azure, and we've also got a multi-cloud strategy, so we have some VMs in, say, AWS. How can we begin to put a governance corral around all of the above? And Arc really speaks to this. Arc covers not just the server scenario, that's what I want to focus in on, but there's also Azure Arc for Kubernetes. So for example, if you've got Kubernetes hosted in AWS, you can apply Azure governance to it. Or if you're a glutton for punishment and you're self-hosting Kubernetes, you can do the same thing. Azure Arc for Servers is the piece of Azure Arc specifically for Windows Server and Linux machines, regardless of where they are. You deploy an agent, a daemon on Linux or a Windows service for Windows, in order to enroll or onboard those machines. And they show up in your Azure subscriptions just like your native Azure VMs do. What does that give you? That allows you to do Azure policy assignments, Azure Auto Manage machine configuration assignments. You can see on this slide here and right around here, let me bring out my drawing tools. You can plot metrics and do log searches using Azure Monitor and Log Analytics. You can surface, this is a big deal, you can surface AI-powered recommendations from Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Another fun fact, MDC, short for Microsoft Defender for Cloud, nowadays also rides on top of Azure policy. You might notice that when you configure your recommendations in MDC, what are you doing under the hood? You're assigning policy initiatives. In fact, there's a default policy initiative that MDC uses called, I think it's called the Microsoft Security Benchmark, but again, I've heard it's changing its name again. But that initiative has hundreds of definitions. It's a good example of what I said earlier, that with Azure policy, you want to think about the initiative level as opposed to individual policies, because you know, something like that security benchmark is a big old initiative that has a lot of related policies underneath it. So that's pretty neat. This is Azure Arc for Servers. And like I said, an agent-based installation that unlocks centralized management where you can, you know, use these native Azure products to manage your machines really wherever they are. I think that's pretty cool. All right, my favorite subject of late, the Microsoft Artificial Intelligence or AI services. How can we and how can our organization save time, save effort, and of course, save money, that little detail, by leveraging AI models in our workloads? And here's the catch, by leveraging pre-created models. I mean, Microsoft certainly has the tool set if you have dedicated data scientists and you have need to develop your own AI models from scratch. Absolutely, that would be, again, let me head on over to the demo land for a second. That would be a case for where we would look at the Azure ML service. The Azure Machine Learning student, we don't want Classic, by the way. Classic is the old V1 that's slowly disappearing. We want this guy over here, the Azure Machine Learning Service. This is going to be a one-stop shop for your data scientists and your data engineers, where you've got a hosted platform to do AI model development end to end. You know, from training a model to deploying and hosting it, it's all under that roof. Very nice, but also it's going to be very intensive of human capital, of money, of time, effort, etc. What I'm thinking of more from a trends perspective are how can you immediately realize those models instead of having to reinvent the wheel? Maybe there's a model that's already out there that suits your use case. So there I would draw your attention to the cognitive services family, which has been historically Microsoft's basketful of pre-trained models that you can just start to tap into. Like as you can see here, speech service, speech to text, text to speech, language translation if you're a multinational global business, speaker recognition. So, you know, you could save a lot of time doing speech, leveraging these models. Language service allows you to do different kinds of translations, a translator for that as well. Q&A maker and language understanding, you know, chat bots, a lot of the vision services where you can do logo detection and company and branding detection. And what's neat about these cognitive services is that some of them allow you to do a little bit of training. So the vision service, for example, custom vision, you could train up that service without having to do end-to-end model training that has a huge learning curve to it and presumptions of PhDs and all that kind of stuff. No, it's not like that. It's a lot more straightforward. You could train the custom vision service to recognize your own business's products. So then you can throw unknown data like a whole bunch of pictures and videos at the service, and it'll spot where your products show up. Those kinds of things. So that's all native Azure. Much more recently, though, with this partnership between Microsoft and OpenAI, we have, I think it's called the Azure AI family. And I'm not even sure, it's Azure OpenAI maybe, right down here. We're going to see that within Azure, it looks like it's reasonably, these products are being reasonably bundled into cognitive services, where you can tap into some of these OpenAI models that have been all the rage nowadays. And again, don't need to get deep in those, but basically we're talking about the Chat GPT service, which is a conversational chatbot that's optimized for language generation. I strongly recommend, if you haven't begun playing with it yet, head on over to, it's an easy DNS name, I go there every day, chat.openai.com. Sign in with your, I use my Google account, and then here we are. I'm actually a Plus member. And you can ask it, what's the meaning of life? I mean, you can do amazing things. Although it's optimized for language, you can also have it do code generation as well. So I could say, for example, write a PowerShell script to create 100 Azure AD user accounts. I mean, that's pretty, you can be more verbose there if you want to. Now, is the response and the code that it generates for you going to be perfect out of box? I would never assume that. You want to, of course, vet anything that comes back from any AI service. But ChatGPT, like I said, it'll do code generation, but primarily it's for language generation. So another service in Azure AI / OpenAI would be the Codex model. And that we could go to the OpenAI playground, but I think to demo this trend, I'm going to open up VS Code. So if you if you've heard of GitHub Copilot, if we go here into the Visual Studio Extension Marketplace and look for GitHub Copilot, this again, ChatGPT works at a free tier, but you're probably going to have hard time getting access during at least the US work days because of, you know, demand. GitHub Copilot is a paid service. I think they're offering something like a 90-day free trial. It's a very generous free trial. So I would strongly recommend you head over to github.com, sign in with your GitHub account. It can be personal or enterprise, and get on board with the free trial for Copilot. So you enable it in your GitHub account, and Copilot supports a few different integrated development environments. I use VS Code, that's my go-to. So your next step would be to go into the marketplace, load up the extension, and then simply sign into GitHub. That's all you have to do to start using Copilot. And you know it's installed because if I look down in the lower right, you see this little pilot icon? It's hard to see probably in the status bar. You can just turn Copilot on or off with a single mouse click. And there's a couple ways to leverage it. It's using one of the OpenAI models called Codex, and this one is specifically for source code generation. And one thing you can do is based on your file type. For example, I'm using a PS1 file, so I'm using PowerShell. I can just use comment syntax to start to generate stuff. Like I could do a similar thing to what I did with ChatGPT a moment ago. I could say, write a PowerShell function that that creates a new Active Directory, if I can type. User, see, I'm getting hints as I'm typing. That's Copilot. I'm going to keep on typing though. An Active Directory, domain services, forest, and root domain. And when I finish that, I'm going to hit Control Enter. And that kicks open a separate editor pane. And now Copilot, using the underlying Codex model, is going to generate up to 10 solutions. And I can just choose this accept solution on any of them to bring it over into my current work file. Now, again, is this perfect? Of course not. I wouldn't expect that. Sometimes you'll get a proposed solution that's exactly what you want. Other times you have to hunt through some noise, and I would always recommend that you vet whatever you get back. So I'm just going to accept the solution for grins. And I mean, that's a huge parameter list right there. I don't know if that's really what I want, but as you can see, it's giving us a proposed function definition, and it looks like it's not finished generating yet. Nuts. But hopefully you see the idea. I don't want to belabor the point. So comment-based, where you just run a free text query, hit Control Enter, and see what Copilot has for you. Another thing that you can try is in your class definitions and your function definitions, as you're writing in whatever language, it really doesn't matter. From what I understand, the model was trained primarily with Python, but the Codex model has scoured all of the public source code throughout all of GitHub. So there's going to be a smattering of everything in there. If I start to write a PowerShell function definition, let's say I say new Azure Active Directory user. And if I open that up, I should see, if I pause a minute, Codex should try to generate code for me. Let me try that again. New Azure AD user account. Codex is just taking what you're typing, like function names, class names, and it's making a good guess. It also will take advantage of other files that are in your workspace and in your work folder. So it might actually reference objects that you've created elsewhere in your folder. It can be kind of scary how personalized those proposals from Copilot come back as. So as you can see, here we have a proposal, and I can, as this little hover says, I can press Tab to accept this recommendation from Copilot, or I could press Escape to dismiss it, or I could look at additional options. I always forget what the keyboard shortcut is for next and previous suggestion. It's either Alt closed square bracket or Control closed square bracket, and then the open square bracket allows you to toggle back and forth. But I've really started to use this little hover thing here, so I can go, it looks like there's 3 suggestions for me here. And again, I can either press Tab to accept it or Escape to ignore it. But the idea here is that you can get past a lot of the initial, what I call scut work, of building a function or a class definition of, or whatever it is in your source code, and more quickly get to your actual logic. So that's a really critically important trend. I would probably put that at number one in my own personal level of importance. See, we've got about 15 minutes left here, so let's keep on trucking. Some other AI-related services that fit into this trend, as you can see, certainly across the Microsoft 365 family. If you're familiar with Power Platform, in Power Platform, Microsoft calls it AI Builder. But basically what it is, it's an entry point into the Azure Cognitive Services. So you might be developing a Power App that's meant to be a low-code way to develop a mobile line of business app without having to know C# or JavaScript and all that. So you're creating the Power App, and maybe you want to have some text recognition capability. Instead of having to invent that from scratch, you could just leverage the AI Builder component and say, I want to do some object detection. Here's what I'd like to do. Maybe I want to do receipt scanning. You just add it in as a component, change a couple properties, and off you go. Especially nowadays, over the last few weeks with this OpenAI push, we're going to see a lot more integration of AI services, particularly the ChatGPT in the Office 365 apps. MS Teams, for example, we're going to expect to see, you probably saw on the news, Team Premium. That's going to involve some cost, of course, like most premium things do. But one thing I'm particularly excited about with the AI into MS Teams is for it to generate a summary of your meetings. Isn't that cool? So you have a meeting, normally the pattern would be record the meeting and then try to find where the recording is, which is normally my weak link, and then scrubbing through the recording to try to find what I needed to review. This is pretty sweet to just be able to get, boom, a nice detailed or concise summary right off the top. All right, so there you have that. What else do we have? I've got a screenshot of the Power Automate console. Power Automate is one of the Power Platform products. This one allows you to build workflows without having to know anything about REST APIs and all that stuff. And as you can see, extract info, I'm just reading some of the examples here. Extracting info from invoices, extracting text from photos and PDFs, that would be optical character recognition. Extracting identity information. Who is this person in this picture, for example? At what time codes in this 60-minute presentation does such and so speak? All of that kind of stuff can be very, very helpful indeed. Okay, next we've got Microsoft Deployment Services. How can we adopt infrastructure as code in Azure? Maybe your business, your software and service development teams are really all in with DevOps methodologies. And so we want our deployment people who are deploying, let's just constrain the discussion to Azure for now. How can they keep their JSON templates in a way where we're preserving changes, where we've got collaborative development, basically what developers have been doing in Git for a long time now. So what we've got here, I know Chris was in Azure DevOps big time during her presentation. This workflow is showing some of those ideas, but what I want to really hone in on are some specific Azure family products you should know about. One would be Bicep. I hope that your teams are already looking at or working at refactoring your existing JSON deployment templates into Bicep, and there's plenty of ways that you can do that, that translation. One would be to just install the Bicep command line interface on your machine and use the Bicep decompile and Bicep build commands to go back and forth between JSON and Bicep. Long story short, Bicep is a domain-specific language, or DSL, that's very similar to HashiCorp configuration language, if you're familiar with HashiCorp Terraform. And it's not a replacement for ARM deployment JSON, because Azure as a REST API needs the JSON whenever it receives a command to do something or deploy something. Instead, Bicep is meant to be an abstraction on top of the JSON to give us a more consistent language, a more comfortable interface for developing simple to complex deployments. So there's Bicep. Hopefully you're on board with that. Related, the template spec, or the ARM template specification. This is an Azure resource that's meant to be kind of sort of like a golden image. You know, if you've done operating system deployment, you'll create a golden deployment image, and you know, you have read access, and then you can deploy virtual machines based on that image. Similar idea here with a template spec. You create a template spec from a bicep or a JSON template, and it becomes a golden master deployment artifact. And what's cool about that is that in Azure, you just need read permissions on the template spec in order to do a deployment. So the idea is that you're keeping the ultimate source of your infrastructure as code in source control. You make a change in source control, you go through your pull request and your typical CI process. You deploy to a template spec in Azure, and then any actual deployments would happen or would spring from that template spec. That's the idea. So at this point, I don't want to speak definitively as far as GA versus public versus private preview. It's all fairly early days with all this stuff. Deployment stacks is definitely, I can say, because I work with that team every day, in private preview still. So that's very early days. The idea of the deployment stack is similar to how Amazon does their deployments by default. So the way this would work end to end, as I said, is let's say that you need to do infrastructure as code for an Azure App Service web app and a SQL Server database, an Azure SQL Server database, and maybe an App Insights instance. Let's just say that. You would record that in source code control in a bicep template. Then at go time, deployment time, you would create a template spec of that deployment. And then when you actually run the deployment, that's where you create a deployment stack that consists of one or more template specs. So we're ready to do our deployment stack. We're going to grab the template spec for the app service. We'll grab the template spec for the App Insights resource. We'll grab the template spec for the Azure SQL database server and database and so on. And you go from there. Well, wait a minute, that sounds needlessly complex. What about just deploying ARM JSON straight off the top? Well, if you've used the Azure Blueprint service, then you already understand the business case with deployment stacks. Big trend alert if you're not aware. Azure Blueprints are gradually going the way of the dodo. Don't use them. If you're thinking of using them, I'd strongly recommend don't. If you are using them, you'll want to keep your eye on this deployment stack stuff, because the engineering team is creating fairly turnkey solutions that allow you to convert your existing blueprint definitions and assignments into stacks. But long story short, when you run that deployment stack, you're able to put a really nice fence around your deployment. So in this example, your app service, your app insights, and your database server and all of that stuff go out and get deployed as usual. But you can put things like read-only locks or just do not delete locks on those resources. So there's some built-in config management there. And so the idea is, in a way, it kind of forces your team to use CI, CD, and DevOps for maintenance, because in the future, if you want to make a change, say, to your app service plan, you're going to go back to source control, make the change in the source template, update the template spec, update the deployment stack. So you've got a much more controlled deployment process. So those hopefully are exciting ideas for you. Let me know if you're interested in joining the deployment stack private preview. I'm glad to get you hooked up with that. All right, here, let's keep on trucking. The last one is hybrid cloud identity. This is a big subject and really critically important, because when we think about it, authentication is everybody's front door into Azure, isn't it? How can we give our local users single sign-on, not only into Azure, but also to our SaaS applications, our software as a service apps? So the trend here is, you might be aware of Azure AD Connect. I mean, it works, it's still fully functional. The trend nowadays is moving towards what's called Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. So whereas the Azure AD Connect tool runs just about entirely on premises as a Windows service, the Cloud Sync is just the opposite, where you're doing centralized command control of your hybrid identity from Azure AD. That also fixes a significant issue with Azure AD Connect in terms of high availability. We used to, and you still, if you're using Azure AD Connect, kind of have to hack around a little bit where you've got only one server that's actively synchronizing identity into Azure AD. And then you've got redundant other machines set up with Azure AD Connect, but they're in staging mode, basically sleeping. And it's just not really a clean solution. The Cloud Sync already has the high availability stuff built into it. So I just wanted to put that on your radar if you weren't already aware. I don't think, it's been a while since I've checked it, but I don't think that there's feature parity yet, full feature parity between the V1 Azure AD Connect client-side tool versus the V2 Azure AD Cloud Sync tool. I know there's a docs article. If you do a Google or Bing search for Azure AD Connect versus Cloud Sync, it'll take you right to that article, and there's a comparison table that shows you feature by feature if it's in both or just in one. I would definitely advise you to take a look at that. But the benefit here is for businesses that have on-premises local AD, you don't want to burden your users with additional credentials. You want to get them into Azure using what they think is their business email address and their local password that they use for CorpNet. You want to give them single sign-on into your Azure AD-backed cloud applications, and then any third-party SaaS integrations that you might have made through Azure AD. And of course, there's the Microsoft 365, Office 365 suite as well. All right, Arino. I think we did some demos. As far as summing up, and then I hope that you'll have some questions for me. I strongly recommend that you dive into these services that I've called out for you specifically, because I do submit that it's going to help you deliver maximum value to your business, to your clients, to your customers, to your stakeholders. Help them future-proof their environment. And also, frankly, helping you future-proof your career, because you'll really be, by focusing on the trends, I found that to be really helpful because, well, I mean, it's kind of clear, isn't it? You have longer and deeper and wider vision than if you were right down in the trenches and the silos each day. So as you can see, there's a link to the, or at least a note to the session materials again, timw.info/AZ Trends, and I'm on Twitter at TechTrainerTim. Thank you. Hit me with your questions. I'm ready. John, anything?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tim. Yeah, I think there are a couple of questions in the chat. So I think, Alan, I don't know if you want to come off mute and just ask Tim your question directly about the deployment stacks. If you're there, Alan.
Yeah, Tim, it's Alan here.
Hi, Alan.
Just a question. You mentioned, obviously, I haven't seen or know what deployment stacks fully are yet, but you mentioned they're using template specs. Is it possible to use a Bicep container registry with them? Do you know?
That I don't know offhand. I'll have to ask, and let me make a note so I don't forget. All right, so everybody, what Alan is talking about is that Bicep has an alternative at this point, a way to centrally store your Bicep templates. And I've always scratched my head a little bit why it's part of Azure Container Registry, but it is. I'll ask the team, and they're really good as far as they want all this out in the public. They're not really proprietary, so I'm not messing with any non-disclosure agreements. If you would check my Twitter over the next 24 hours, Alan, Tech Trainer Tim, that's where I'll post the response I get from the team, okay? Thanks for your question.
No problem.
Thanks, Alan. I think there was a little bit of a chat earlier on around when I think we were talking about the private DNS zones, Tim. I think, Matt, you mentioned about, was that the thing that you could do with Azure Firewall? So I don't know whether, was that what you meant, Matt?
Yeah, there used to be a thing called DNS proxy. I think Alan picked it up, actually, picked up the answer that was in Azure Firewall that did some of that DNS forwarding. From what Alan was saying, it sounds like it's actually a new service now. So.
Yeah, I don't think that the Azure Private DNS, Private Resolver, it doesn't have a dependency on Firewall. So I don't know about what you're mentioning, a feature with that in Azure Firewall myself. I'll look into it. Thanks for raising it.
Cool. I think that was it that I spotted in terms of questions. Are there any other questions from the room before we thank Tim? Well, we can thank Tim as well, of course we can, but I think everybody's quiet. But no, Tim, thank you so much. That was an awesome session. I think it's one of those sessions where there's so much going on with cloud at the moment that just getting that kind of refresher, it's a great kind of topic area just to raise some of the questions and start getting people thinking about these other areas. So thank you for coming on and kind of imparting that knowledge, Tim. It's really, really is appreciated. Some great food for thought in that session, I think, isn't there?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're welcome. It was my pleasure to be with you all. Definitely, everybody, grab that slide deck, because I know that I presented a whole lot of dense info. So I want you to dive into that stuff and be fruitful. Thanks again for having me. Have a great night.
No, appreciate that. I just dropped that link in the chat. But Tim, thanks very much again.
Sure.
You're more than welcome to stick around for the quiz. We're going to have our quiz now. So everybody want to give their emoticons and their appreciation for Tim? Perfect. Cool. There we go. 2 awesome chats again tonight. So without further ado, should we just go straight on into the quiz?
Let's rock with it. Yeah. So everyone's going to need to have a browser available. And I'm just going to find the right screen. Everyone should be able to see that.
Got you. Oh,
see the behind the scenes stuff. There you go. So what are we doing? 10 questions we've got. Let's go and do that one. So there we go. There's your QR code, or you can go to the address.
John,
for those that have not seen
on
this
the screen here.
We got problems?
I've got a blank screen. No, I've just got a blank screen.
You might just do a.
I got somehow managed to do something stupid. Yes, I have. Where's the content gone? You couldn't pop the link in chat, could you?
Yeah.
Does it work the same as Kahoot?
Yep. So for those that have not seen this before, this is a bespoke, custom-built. From this type, if you go back and have a look at this time last year, I think I did a talk on this particular topic. In fact, it's Blazor, C#, Blazor WebAssembly, SignalR based quiz application.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Where's it running, Matt?
Where's it running? It's
AWS.
running in UK South.
Yeah, AWS. And it's open source as well. You can grab the code and deploy it to your own tenant.
You can do if you want to. Yeah. And there's going to be some. So interestingly, on the Chat GPT and the Bing chat front, some of the questions from tonight were generated using the Bing chat front, the new Bing chat functionality.
Interesting.
Now the question is, which ones was it? Because I can't remember.
Nicholas has got some. You can put
Yes, I saw. Yeah. No, by all means, log it. I'll put the
raise an issue.
In fact, actually, there we go. That's there as well. You can raise an issue on there. All feedback always welcome. All right, now I've got to go back to quiz. There we go.
Is anybody else struggling to load it?
Who's running into problems?
I think, Alan, was that you? Are you still having problems?
Yeah, it's not loading. It's just, it's got a loading message and then it's...
Which browser you want to have interest?
Edge.
Okay, that should be the same.
I'll try it on this machine. Hang on a minute.
So we got 15 in the chat, 9. Is there other people that can't get on? If you're struggling to get on, drop us a message and the chat will come off mute.
Stop loading. Tried 2 different machines and all I'm getting is loading ...
Are you on a corporate machine, Alan? Out of interest?
No, yes and no. I've got a corporate one and a personal one. So
I wonder whether you've got any. I wonder whether it's WebSockets being blocked under the hood. That's the only thing I can think it would be.
Well, it shouldn't be on my personal one.
Anyone else having problems?
Don't think we've got everybody joined yet, so I don't know whether
hang on,
everybody.
it's just wait a minute. It's just loaded on one of them. What was the code? Sorry.
8051.
Well, that looks like it's not blocked. It just, for some reason, took quite a long time to load.
Weird. What's your internet connection like?
Pretty good.
Yeah. It's one of the side effects of it being Blazor WebAssembly, actually, out of interest, is that the payload size for the download is quite chunky. Because it's effectively downloading binaries. Thank you very much, Nicholas.
I think Nick is on. Is anybody else now struggling to get on?
I need something to do while waiting for everyone else to get on.
No, it's all appreciated. You might notice if you have a look in the issues, there's a couple of things looking at ChatGPT and DALL-E as well. Actually, interestingly, I've got some ideas as to what I can do with that and the OpenAI platform as well. Okay, I'm going to kick this off now. There's 10 questions. If everyone's ready. Yep. First question. What's the default name of a file that defines a YAML pipeline in Azure DevOps? That was definitely one that was generated by OpenAI, because it's a ridiculous question. And I echo what Tim was saying, vet any answers you get back from AI services. What's the name of the task that publishes test results to Azure DevOps? This is an obscure one. I think this was another AI generated one actually as well. It's published test results. Ooh, split the audience there. That's good. This was another OpenAI one, so it's a bit challenging. This one, what's the name of the condition that checks if the previous stage was successful in a build pipeline in Azure DevOps? I took a guess as to what Chris was going to be talking about, so I don't think it paid off. Succeeded stage is the right answer. What's the name of the parameter that specifies the branch to trigger a build pipeline in Azure DevOps? In fact, I think all of these were AI generated.
It's like an AZ400 test here.
Hey, on that, hold that thought a minute.
We get a certificate at the end of this one, do we, Matt?
Yep, hang on a minute. Designing and implementing a Microsoft DevOps solution is which exam number?
Oh, brilliant.
Anyone gets that wrong now, I'll be very disappointed in you. Well done. Excellent. Which Microsoft product officially launched in February 2020? Defender Threat Intelligence, Cognitive Search, the Chromium version of Edge, or Bing? Might have been Bing. Don't know what you're talking about, Thomas. It was the Edge Chromium version. Which stream-friendly feature might be coming to Windows 11 soon? This was announced on the news sites, I think it was last week. It's RGB controls. So all you people with the fancy lighting systems, no more relying on a third-party app. So you'll be able to natively do it in Windows. Approximately how much did a bad AI demo cost Alphabet on the markets recently? Hint, it was a lot of money. It was a lot of virtual money. It was $100 billion it wiped off their share price, market value.
12% the first day, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's a bad demo. That's what I would class as a very bad demo.
Yeah, they couldn't find the phone, could they?
No. Bing AI chat accidentally gave out its code name. And you might have seen this on the registry or on Ars Technica. What was the name of the Bing AI chat's code name? It was Sydney. Well done, the 5 of you got that right. What's the name of the Microsoft chatbot that was corrupted by the internet in 2016? I think this is the last question. The correct answer was Tay. Well done. What happens when you feed a chatbot Reddit? And our winner is Graham.
Here we are. Graham and Nick. Are we
Nick.
doing first and second, Matt? Yeah, I presume we are. We're normally
Yeah.
quite generous like that, aren't we? So
What went on, John? You came fourth this time. What's going on?
Well, yeah, I know. It's obviously my AZ 400 skills aren't up to scratch at the minute, so. Right, Graham, Nick, do me a favor, drop me over your email addresses on LinkedIn or Twitter, just something that'll prompt me to send an email tomorrow to get those voucher codes sorted for you. And well done both. Congratulations. Cool. Thanks as always, Matt. Awesome quiz.
Pleasure.
Share the screen. We'll take the session to the end. Right. So, yep, let's wrap this up then. So thank you, everybody, for joining. As always, it's been a pleasure. We've had 2 fantastic sessions tonight. Huge thanks to Kristina and Tim for jumping on us tonight and giving us some cracking sessions around DevOps, AKS, multi-stage pipelines, all the good stuff from ADO, and a huge thanks to Tim as well for the insights really into what should we be thinking about with Azure in 2023. So hope you've enjoyed the sessions as much as I have. We've got next month's event scheduled already, and you'll be glad to know that we're going to be talking about Kubernetes again next month with Kubernetes scaling with Kida. So Wolfgang is going to join us, and we've got Safe on as well to talk about Azure Arc, something that Tim brought up tonight as one of those concepts to look out for 2023. So a little bit of hybrid love. So there we go. That's 15th of March. Save the dates in the calendar. If you can, spare us another 2 minutes just to give us a little bit of feedback, scan that QR code or visit that URL. But for now, thank you everybody for joining. Have a great rest of your evening. And yeah, we will see you all next month. Thanks for now.
Thanks all.
Take care. Bye-bye.